Hey friends, look over here. It's 2025, a year where your hot, heaping helping of some always comes with a supersized side of more, smothered in news sauce, plus a free medium Mountain Dude, Cody, me. I'm Cody. It's some more news is my point, okay? And here is some of that news. To about 48.3% of the population that voted, and maybe more, things are bad. Yeah, it checks out. But here's some more news. Everything is extra bad if you're trans in America. Thanks to Trump's Supreme Court, conservative states and judges have been pushing a ban on gender-affirming care for minors. Gender-affirming care is highly individualized and perhaps unsurprisingly on a spectrum that can be medical, mental health-based, etc. It's a nuanced subject that our now new president again vowed to stop on day one. To quote, "Stop the transgender lunacy" on day one. Also on day one, he made billions of dollars in Bitcoin with his meme coin. One of the benefits of being the president. One of the other not very good things he did on day one was sign an executive order that says that in America, there are only two sexes, male and female. It's official. So what of those who would like to transition from one to the other? What about what's in between? What about a third thing? Well, since there's only two, we're going to also ignore that in going from one to the other. There's probably something in between at the very least. Like it's like a spectrum, right? In between, like if there's one and the other, like in between, it'd be a spectrum. But never mind all of that. There's currently no executive order or law that says transitioning is not possible. So this whole conversation is legal for now. But they still want to ban it all for all ages, but specifically any type of gender-affirming care for minors. It's not just conservatives pushing these bans, which are justified as protection for these kids. It's not bigotry, you see. These lawmakers are protecting impressionable kids who, thanks to the MTVs, have been manipulated into thinking that they're trans. It's a fad, like being gay or black or left-handed. They'll grow out of it. That's the implication when conservative pundits or lawmakers talk about eradicating transgender ideology, right? That trans people don't actually exist. It's all fake, you see. And I guess the real point of this video, something we hope you get from it, is that it's not fake. Transgender people are real and they exist. Trans people are real. They just are. Sorry, snowflakes, but let's investigate this claim that it's just a fad. We can just ask the growing detransitioning movement, as in former trans people who have now swapped back and or claim to regret transitioning in the first place. There have been multiple articles and documentaries about this apparent rise. Documentaries are never wrong, as we all know. It has document right in the word, and that word has come in it. Those are just facts. But it would be pronounced cume. So, fake news. But here's some unfake news in the form of a question. Is there a rise, not just of detransitioning, but of trans people in general? It's hard to find a solid number for this. Depending on the study, there's around 1 to 5% of teenagers who identify as transgender in the United States or are questioning their gender identity. Mind you, that's identifying includes non-binary people as well as people not actually medically transitioning. So it's weird that some folks seem so focused on it. It seems like, dare I speculate, but it seems like they are making a very big stink over trans people in sports and bathrooms and wherever else, when statistically speaking, those issues are never going to actually affect most Americans. On the flip side, if you have a friend or family member who is trans, these laws against them will affect you. According to one poll, 44% of Americans know a trans person, and that number has been going up. Maybe it's good that people are more comfortable being themselves and opening up to, well, at least apparently 44% of Americans so far. Anyway, for the record, I'm not saying that nobody ever detransitions. What I am saying is that the so-called rise of teens and adults becoming trans and then detransitioning isn't really a thing, because being transgender is a thing. There isn't a big scary problem with teens thinking they're trans and then regretting it, nor is there a sweeping problem with trans people at all, unless the problem is the fact that this really small percentage of the population has been suddenly harassed and demonized by the media and an entire political party for nefarious purposes. Nor should the fact that some people detransition be used to push the notion that transgender people are lunacy that needs to be eradicated. But you don't have to take my word for it. I'm actually going to explain with sources and facts and junks why all of those things I just said are true. It'll be very compelling, much like this documentary's lies that, if true, would be super compelling. But they're not, so they're not.
There was a study looking at the Swedish population of those who had transitioned that found that those who had transitioned had suicide rates 19 times higher than population-matched controls.
Look at that! They have numbers and facts. They are citing a specific study, this study, saying that people who transition are more likely to commit suicide. Nobody wants that! That's like the opposite of what we want teens doing. It's what people hope transitioning will prevent. Except, here's a novel idea. Let's read the study. Again, as you can see, it's literally the same study they cite, which, if you read it, says, quote, "For the purpose of evaluating whether sex reassignment is an effective treatment for gender dysphoria, it is reasonable to compare reported gender dysphoria pre- and post-treatment. Such studies have been conducted either prospectively or retrospectively and suggest that sex reassignment of transsexual persons improves quality of life and gender dysphoria." They then quote an ass ton of studies showing that transitioning improves the lives of people with gender dysphoria. Here's a handful of those studies on the screen, all of which show the majority of people who transitioned were either happier or didn't regret the transition. They also point out that this high rate only applied to people who transitioned before 1989. Quote, "Even though the overall mortality was increased across both time periods, it did not reach statistical significance for the period 1989 to 2003. And by they, I mean at least one of the authors, Cecilia Dene, who, when interviewed about this study, flat out said that it was being misused by the media. She also pointed out that the likely reason the suicide rates were higher in the past was because there was less effective healthcare and more of a social stigma around transgender people. More than now! She highlighted this Huffington Post article as the correct assessment of her work. That article points out that being trans is just hard, whether you transition or not, because people treat you differently. For example, making a documentary about how you're going to kill yourself because you regret your transition. And this is the first way these documentaries or think pieces or pundits lie directly to people's faces. They take a study, cherry pick the contents, and skew it to seem like they're using some kind of actual science or objectivism. The second and arguably more messed up tactic they use is taking actual detransitioned teens and adults and parading them out as proof. Here's a documentary from whatever Epoch TV thinks it is, called Gender Transformation: The Untold Realities.
When did parents become enemy number one?
This is all coming from the top, the major corporations, governments, politicians.
You have a pipeline. It's also in the education system.
So today we're going to talk a bit about genders. We are here to support you.
I feel like I couldn't breathe. My aching body.
Sorry, docudrama. As you can see, the trailer is mainly reenactments based on interviews with parents and a single doctor, not trans people, about how concerned they are about trans kids, and how, I guess it's this big government cabal making kids be trans. They really want people to think that the parents are these scrappy underdogs against the big gay machine. It's actually the gays who are oppressors, you see. The evil empire run by Supreme Leader Woke. But to be fair, and Bede, this docudrama does have actual detransitioner interviews buried within.
They told my parents if I wasn't allowed to transition, I would be at risk of suicide.
This was a group where they basically gathered vulnerable children and taught them that it was us against them.
That is one of just 4 detransitioned people in this thing. Just 4. Here it is on IMDb. And as you can see, the vast majority of people interviewed are parents and teachers and this one psychiatrist who shows up in multiple anti-trans documentaries. And in fact, of those 4 detransitioned interviews, 3 of those people have IMDb credits with multiple anti-trans documentaries on them. That's weird. like it's the same handful of people every time. One of them, Chloe Cole, has 24 credits as a detransitioner on various shows. Here she is on Fox News telling parents to ignore the advice of doctors and refuse to transition their kids.
At age 17, Chloe changed her mind and detransitioned, and today she decided to fight back, filing a groundbreaking lawsuit against Kaiser and the doctors who she says performed a sex change experiment on her.
Thank you, Laura, for having me. My message to parents right now is, unfortunately, you might have to go against the advice of the doctors right now, and to keep your kids away from this ideology, to keep them away from this experimentation.
We'll get more into this later, but this is all to say that these documentaries and news clips aren't really about an epidemic of teens detransitioning, but rather literally the same 5 or 6 teens. That's it. Multiple documentaries and think pieces and Fox News specials around, like, a decent group number for poker. And I'm not trying to take anything away from those people's experiences. I'm sure there are people who regret transitioning. But as far as we know, most don't. The vast most. And these few people are being used to justify the kind of legislation that's happening in America. Legislation that's making it even harder for trans people to navigate an already impossible process. That's what's so freaking wild about this claim that kids are being peer pressured to impulsively transition like it's getting a piercing or shaving your head. Hormones absolutely require a prescription from a medical professional, as well as jumping through a whole series of extra hoops depending on which regressive laws have recently been passed in your state. Hell, testosterone is a controlled substance, especially the way I use it. Surgeries are even more restricted, usually requiring multiple letters from doctors and psychiatrists, even in progressive states. Wait lists are often months to years long, and even if you get on a wait list, the odds that your insurance will fully cover gender-affirming care are 50-50 at best and constantly being relitigated. That's a pretty long and arduous journey for a life-ruining fad that kids are being pressured into doing and will eventually regret. To hear them tell it, it won't be long before we're dealing with a massive wave of detransitioners suing their schools and parents for forcing them down the path to transness.
We're going to have thousands of young people who are detransitioning. They're going to be mad at what's happened. And so I honestly think maybe it's 5 years, maybe it's 10 years, that this is all going to end.
You heard it here first. In 5 or maybe 10 years, the trans fad that's been around since at least ancient Mesopotamia will end. And when it does, it'll be a huge event, mass detransitions. Anti-trans activists have long claimed that 80 to 90% of trans-identified teens will eventually desist or stop being trans on their own when left to their own devices. For example,
and it was not disclosed to her family or to her that for example, teenage transitioners desist from transition at a 80 to 90% rate, that the majority of people who go through this regret it later on.
Hey, it's that lawyer from before. Weird. Hope we talk about her later. Okay. What they commonly cite is a study called Desisting and Persisting Gender Dysphoria After Childhood, a Qualitative Follow-Up, published by Dr. Thomas Steensma. It was maybe what Joanne KKK Rowling was referring to in that blog post from a while back, but she didn't cite anything, so who can say? The study is hugely flawed in multiple obvious ways that really makes it seem like Dr. Steensma is either stupid or a liar, or perhaps a third thing. Maybe it's a spectrum. That's something I need to point out, actually. It's often extremely easy and even fun to disprove this stuff if you just read it a little bit. Because reading is magic. Readius bookium. In the case of this study, it doesn't differentiate between kids with actual persistent documented gender dysphoria and kids who just acted a little more outside their gender norm. And boy, it's way worse than it sounds. Like, here's how they describe the girls with gender dysphoria. Quote, "The girls had clearly masculine interests and preferred activities such as soccer, playing sports games on the computer, climbing trees, building huts, and getting into mischief with other boys." Sports games? Tree climbing? Huts? I kid you not. They define playing soccer as a sign of gender dysphoria. Soccer! Because kicking a little toy around as a fun game is owned by masculinity. And so, according to this study, if you were a bit of a tomboy as a girl, or were a boy that played with Barbie dolls, and then you grew out of it as an adult, you detransitioned. The plot of miscongeniality, according to this study, is an example of detransitioning. Almost literally, because a lot of the examples in the study are flat out fictional as well. It turns out that they were unable to locate at least 45% of the children they intended to follow up with. And instead of noting that, they decided to just count them all in the detransitioner column too. Why? Because they didn't show back up at a single gender identity clinic. Quote, the other 24 adolescents did not reapply for treatment at the gender identity clinic during adolescence. As the Amsterdam Gender Identity Clinic for Children and Adolescents is the only one in the country, we assumed that their gender dysphoric feelings had desisted and that they no longer had a desire for sex reassignment. Or a desire to play soccer or whatever. So they assumed. The study says assumed. There are so many reasons they might not have come back to a gender identity clinic for children, even if it's the only one in that area. For one, maybe they weren't children when they finally decided to transition. Maybe they died, or moved, or went broke, or went missing after escaping the Midnight Realm. You can't just assume the reason was that they were no longer feeling dysphoric. That is garbage science. But also, as we said, their entire definition of dysphoric was wrong. And also, maybe, just maybe, the reason some of those kids didn't transition was because they were forced not to. That's the thing about these studies. Even if they weren't lying about the data, it's weird how incurious they are about why a child with gender dysphoria might not transition later in life. Because the reason is often horrifying and has nothing to do with the kid losing interest. To put it in polite terms, it's most likely due to external factors. Here's a study that surveyed over 27,000 transgender adults and asked them if they ever detransitioned at some point in their lives. 2,242 of them said yes, and of that number, 82.5% reported at least one external driving factor for it. Most often, pressure from family or social ridicule. Only about 16% pointed to any internal factors like doubt, meaning that the reason these people detransitioned was almost exclusively because some dickheads bullied them into it. So you see how circular the logic is here. Trans people are pressured to hide who they are by family or friends who think it's a phase, then become a statistic for people to use to prove that being trans is a phase. Ultimately, the anti-trans contingent has no choice but to rely on these shoddy studies and bad logic from weirdos or people they're misinterpreting, because as it turns out, the not flawed data shows that transitioning is good, actually. Wow, did you look at that? Giving trans teens access to gender-affirming care has been shown to decrease the likelihood of depression by 60% and decrease the odds of suicidality by as much as 73%. I don't know about you, but I personally think it's awesome when teenagers don't kill themselves. Just a weird thing about me. Other people who don't want teens to kill themselves and support transitioning are such groups as the American Academy of Pediatrics, the American Psychiatric Association, and also the American Psychological Association, as well as the American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry and the American Medical Association. I know we're in a post-trust world, but I trust those groups more than a smattering of misinterpreted studies, conservative docudramas, disgraced doctors, or fantasy authors posting their idle hate on X, the everything transphobic app. Even comparative meta-analyses of all the existing studies point to a rate of regret or desistance well below 5% among youth who access gender-affirming care, which is less than 90%. But I'm not, that lawyer will eventually talk about it. I promise we're going to talk about her, but I'm not her, so what do I know, you know? For now, it's hard to say for sure how many detransitioners are really out there. Data on trans healthcare is frustratingly limited. It's almost like no one is looking into it for some reason. Instead, a major nation like England will release something like the Cass Review, a 2024 report that was used in justifying laws aimed at limiting trans healthcare. What's kind of wild about the Cass Review is that while it's being used to uphold bans on puberty blockers, the report itself doesn't really come down hard one way or another. You ever get in an argument when someone's like just talking and they're not really saying anything, but they're just arguing at you? That's this. The key findings are just a series of written shrugs, such as, quote, "The strengths and weaknesses of the evidence based on the care of children and young people are often misrepresented and overstated, both in scientific publications and social debate." That statement literally cancels itself out, right? Sometimes these strengths and weaknesses are exaggerated. Okay. The strongest stance it does take is on puberty blockers, saying, quote, "The rationale for early puberty suppression remains unclear, with weak evidence regarding the impact on gender dysphoria, mental or psychosocial health. The effect on cognitive and psychosexual development remains unknown," which again isn't very strongly stated. Ultimately, all it really says is that medical practitioners should be careful when transitioning teenagers, a thing they already are being. Like, here's a direct quote from the CAS review. "The option to provide masculinizing/feminizing hormones from age 16 is available, but the review would recommend an extremely cautious clinical approach. There should be a clear clinical rationale for providing hormones at this stage rather than waiting until an individual reaches 18. So, okay. It's not saying it should be banned, just that we should be careful, like from a clinical approach. Cool. That's fine. Good. Let's keep doing that. There's a recent Yale report that does a very good job of breaking down the problems with the CAS review. And so I'd like to just run through some points from that. For starters, they noted that the language used in the review was rather pseudoscientific, relying on words like weak and poor without creating hard definitions of those terms. It also seemed ignorant of how other areas of pediatric medicine functioned. They cite a quote from Dr. Cass saying, "I can't think of any other situation where we give life-altering treatments and don't have enough understanding about what's happening to those young people in adulthood." And then they point out that we do that all the time. Pediatricians give all kinds of treatments to children, surgeries, medications, body alterations, without knowing how that is going to affect them into adulthood. And a lot of the CAS review starts from incorrect premises like that. One of the things it repeatedly asserts is that there is an uptick of teens identifying as trans that can't be explained simply by more kids feeling comfortable being out. They call this rise exponential. But as the Yale report points out, they aren't using that word correctly. You can't just use that word. It means something. And as you can see, that rise clearly plateaus. Also, the data they are using aren't of teens transitioning. The CAS review is actually saying there's a rise in referrals to the UK's Gender Identity Service. That doesn't mean those referrals lead to treatment. Ultimately, the problem with the CAS review comes from this quote from Yale. "The review does not consider the most likely explanation for why most youth who receive early supportive interventions continue onto gender-affirming hormone therapy. That they are indeed transgender. It is not social transition and puberty-pausing medications that drive a persistent transgender identity. It is a transgender identity that drives social transition and subsequent medical interventions." That kind of says it all. And it's what I'm saying to you, the 56% of Americans who allegedly don't know a trans person. It's not trans lunacy contagion that needs to be eradicated. They are indeed transgender. The CAS review and a lot of pseudoscientific reports like it are starting from the idea that a person can't simply be transgender, that it must be caused by some outside factor, and they're trying to pin down what that is. And they've especially glommed onto the fact that there is a small percentage of people who do regret transitioning. There's no denying that this happens. So when the showdy continues, we will get into what the actual percentage of people who detransition is, why they do it, and how they feel about it afterward. Hint, they still want your respect. Wait, that's not a hint, that's just saying what it is. Damn, oh well. Well, first, we're gonna go to ads. We will be back exponentially. Hey there, friends! I want to tell you about this thing I discovered called news. That stands for new stuff. Unfortunately, this new stuff is often very bad. A lot of slop out there, it seems. But you can weed out the slop over at Ground News, which you can find via the QR code on the screen. That's a sponsor we at the Showdy sought out that's both a website and an app. It gathers news from around the world from the entire political spectrum and allows us to compare coverage and verify our information. So, for example, looking at the president's inauguration, Ground News gives nearly 130 headlines about Trump's first speech. While a lot of them are what you'd expect, there's this one from Gateway Pundit that says, quote, President Trump humiliates Democrats with blistering opening lines of inauguration speech, destroys crooked Joe Biden and his dirty shadow regime. Hey, that's slop! I found the slop! Really long slop too, way too long of a headline. It's like the SEO pandering slop that you should avoid. Thanks, Ground News! And you can filter the slop and get all these headlines plus context on each publication over at ground.news/SMN. With that link, you can save 40% off unlimited access. Ground News will give you the tools you need to stay informed, such as a factuality chart and a blind spot feed that shows you stories the media isn't covering. So check them out. Again, that's ground.news/SMN to get 40% off unlimited access for yourself or someone you know. The link is in the description. The slop is all over the place.
Hi, I'm Katy, here to tell you about the importance of enjoying the little things in life. For example, I like to ride the bus and make a quiet humming sound with my mouth until the person sitting next to me starts crying. I now have the time to enjoy the little things in life thanks to Found. That is a banking business platform that lets you effortlessly do stuff like track expenses, manage invoices, and even prepare your taxes. You can set aside money and control your spending with virtual cards, and it saves me both the time and money to ride the bus all day, doing my hums, haunting the passengers. It's so fun. You gotta try it. Oh, and by the way, other small businesses are loving Found too. This Found user said that Found is going to save me so much headache. It makes everything so much easier. Expenses, income, profit, taxes, invoices even. How about that? And Found has 30,000 five-star reviews just like this. So open a Found account for free at found.com/more news. Found is a financial technology company, not a bank. Banking services are provided by Piermont Bank, member FDIC. Don't put this one off, folks. Join thousands of small business owners who have streamlined their finances with Found.
Hi! Wow, we're back, and we're good, and we're gonna talk about some regrets. We all have them. I regret telling Katy that we have the same blood type. And before the break, we mentioned that there are people who have absolutely transitioned and then detransitioned. And we were wondering, aloud, why? Not that it's really our business, but it seems like our government has forced it to be. That's weird. For starters, as we keep pointing out, the number of people who have detransitioned is already very small. Just ask the CAST review, which notes that in one analysis of 3,306 patients in the UK, fewer than 10 detransitioned. That's a detransition rate of 0.3%. But why do those people detransition? What about regret? Well, the number of people who detransition specifically out of regret is also shockingly small. According to a 2021 meta-analysis, less than 1% of participants in gender-affirming surgery regretted it. For context, the regret rate for successful knee surgery is 2.9%, which you may recognize as more than 1%. Gender-affirming surgery has a lower regret rate than almost any other elective surgery. Even the CAST review acknowledges it in the most hilarious way. Direct quote, "For birth-registered females, the impact of testosterone will give a higher sex drive than they might have experienced during their biological puberty, and after 1 year will result in robust increases in muscle mass and strength. In the absence of any experience as an adult cis woman, they may have no frame of reference to cause them to regret or detransition." In other words, their explanation for why trans men don't regret transitioning is because they have cool muscles and fuck real good and like it. Their reason for why they don't regret it is because they don't regret it. They're too busy enjoying the decision they made. So what is the fucking problem? There's a reason most decent insurances, if you can call any insurance decent, cover at least some aspects of transition. because it is a necessary and often life-saving procedure that literally no one would embark upon willy-nilly because they binged a season of Transparent and got carried away. And so, no, the vast majority of people don't regret it. That said, there are other reasons someone might detransition. For example, external factors like pressure from a parent or other family member, difficulty finding a job or pressure from an employer, or straight up harassment and discrimination. The world is, as you might be aware, not as kind to trans people as, say, Hero on the Hudson Sully Sullenberger. The trans writer of this episode has asked me to share their unique and hard-won insight that being trans sucks sometimes. That's not an argument for making it harder to transition, it's an argument for making the world easier to live in for trans people, which seems obvious, but I guess it is not. The last big argument the anti-trans throng likes to make is that regardless of what detransition rates may be currently, trans kids aren't actually trans. They're being tricked by social media trends, by ill-meaning teachers and doctors, gender activists, dark wizards, and so on. Even self-described lifelong liberals like New York Times columnist Pamela Paul will go right the on and publish 4,500-word op-eds riddled with factual errors and baseless claims about trans kids they know nothing about. Pam uses a lot of the same misinformation we've already covered, but the thing I want to highlight is her claim that gender dysphoria is some kind of trend or social contagion. Quote, others refer to this phenomenon, with some controversy, as rapid onset gender dysphoria, in which adolescents, particularly tween and teenage girls, express gender dysphoria despite never having done so when they were younger. She cites this study as the source for that, this redacted study. It was redacted because it pulled, without consent, results of a survey on a site called parentsofrogdkids.com. That site is self-described as a group of parents whose children have suddenly, seemingly out of the blue, decided they identify strongly with the opposite sex. So right away, this is not very scientific at all. They literally have no confirmation of who is posting on that site. This is also a very common talking point. It's something that J.K. Rowling also brought up in her blog post a few years back. She quoted a researcher named Lisa Littman who said, parents online were describing a very unusual pattern of transgender identification where multiple friends and even entire friend groups became transgender identified at the same time. I would have been remiss had I not considered social contagion and peer influences as potential factors. So, are you noticing a pattern in this evidence? In both cases, the proof that becoming trans is a social contagion, and that entire friend groups are suddenly and without warning becoming trans, is the parents. Or sometimes anonymous people claiming to be parents online. And here's a question. Did you tell your parents everything you were doing or thinking or feeling when you were doing or thinking or feeling it? It's such a clear flaw in their reasoning, such oblivious academic oversight to assume that these kids would inform their parents the moment they started questioning their gender. It's like posting on a forum, my son came out to me as gay, but I've never seen him kiss a boy before. Are his friends tricking him into thinking he's gay? I'm not the only one who is pointing this out, as the freaking Journal of Pediatrics did as well. Like, if your kid's friend group suddenly all came out as trans, it's not because they were enthralled by a gay Nosferatu, but more likely they all knew they were trans, gravitated towards each other, and then had the support system to come out around the same time. It's so obvious unless you choose to be a fucking alien about it. I can't really stress enough how bad faith and obtuse these people are. Going back to Pamela Paul's opinion piece, she claims that if anyone speaks out against gender-affirming care, they are automatically labeled a bigot. Her example is a marriage therapist named Stephanie Wynn, who, as she puts it, spoke out in favor of approaching gender dysphoria in a more considered way, and then was attacked by the woke mob. What? They're so intolerant. How dare people get mad at this lady for, let's see, suggesting that we should give trans masculine people estrogen and that dysphoric children should be treated with acupuncture so they can see how they like having needles put in them, with the hopes that the child's hatred of needles could help spark desistance. That's wrong. I don't know. Call me woke, but if someone is wrong and bad about something, I think it's fine to not listen to them. Like saying that a child should be treated with acupuncture to make them hate needles is stupid, right? Not only is it cruel and weird and not the considered idea that was claimed to be, but it also just completely misunderstands acupuncture. If anything, successful acupuncture would make someone more comfortable with needles, right? No acupuncturist is out there saying, oh yeah, we just stab you full of needles. It hurts and everyone hates it. Highly recommend. This is just something an ignorant person would say. And she claims that it's just a thought experiment, but she discusses it like it's a good idea that you should try. But it's a thought experiment, but you could try it and it could work. But it's a thought experiment that I like. It's weird, and it's very clear that this is all just the musings of random people with absolutely no medical background. Like, Pamela Paul isn't a doctor. That she's made very clear. And she either cites redacted studies or one-on-one interviews with detransitioners that she uses to make broad points. And I guess the only thing left to ponder is that which we always ponder. Is she stupid or a liar? What side of the propaganda is she on? Is she pitching or catching? A true believer? Is she being paid? Is she a subby top or a dommy bottom, is my point. And not just her. Like, Pamela Paul was married to Brett Stevens, so she's probably just nuts from all the bed bugs. But there is this whole ecosystem of personalities who are very concerned with the personal lives of trans kids they will never meet. Some of them, like Pamela and her ex-husband, are probably just doing it to sustain a home built on viral op-eds. Like, wow, they were married. Do they have kids? Can we do a wellness check on those hypothetical kids? But while what Pamela does is absolutely insidious, it is but a toad's fart compared to some of the mechanisms at play behind this influx in anti-trans propaganda. And to explain that, we're going to go back to those detransitioning documentaries and the fact that, of course, every accusation is always a confession.
When did parents become enemy number one?
This is all coming from the top, the major corporations, governments, politicians.
You have a pipeline. It's also in the education system.
Look, maybe somewhere there is a secret cabal of high school teachers trying to make your kids trans, but they're not doing a great job of it. What I do know is there absolutely is a top-down effort to demonize trans people for political purposes. As we mentioned at the start of this, all of these docs tend to feature the same people. That's not a coincidence. A select few of these detransitioned people have seemingly become the conservative A-team of fake experts traveling from state to state to advocate for blanket bans on gender-affirming care. The core crew consists of Soren Aldacco, Prisha Mosley, and Chloe Cole, as well as a few other bit players here and there. Aldacco testified back in 2023 as part of an effort to ban gender-affirming care for minors in Texas, a bill which passed and has since joined a number of other state bills slowly making their way up to the Supreme Court, where they will surely be heard by a fair and impartial court and ruled on without bias. Please don't fact-check me on that. Prisha Mosley, who has spoken at hearings in 5 different states, almost exclusively compares gender-affirming surgeries to lobotomies, an obviously dangerous mischaracterization of the transgender community. And we, of course, can't forget Chloe Cole, the Professor X of XY chromosome enforcement. She regularly guests on Fox News and travels all across the country to advocate for bans on gender-affirming care. Cole is so influential with her advocacy work that a Wyoming lawmaker named his bill to ban transition care for minors Chloe's Law. Great stuff, truly awesome. Chloe also made headlines recently after her testimony in a case against Kaiser, the insurance company that covered her gender-affirming surgery before she detransitioned, went viral. And while these people are young and perhaps will eventually realize that what they're doing is misguided and terrible for so many people, the real stars here are the people behind the scenes.
And it was not disclosed to her family or to her that for example, teenage transitioners desist from transition at a 80 to 90% rate, that the majority of people who go through this regret it later on.
Hey, it's that clip from before where they say the wrong thing that is false. And it's those people who keep showing up. Because now we have to talk about the woman speaking on the right. That's Harmeet Dillon, an attorney who is very selective about the cases she chooses to take on. Very selective and specific and kind of random. Like, you know how there are normally entertainment lawyers or bird lawyers? Dillon seems to be a jack of all trades. She represented Andy Ngo when he was allegedly attacked during a protest, probably for being a fascist propagandist with a fake British accent or lying about where a hammer came from. So, like, she's an injury lawyer. Well, she also sued UC Berkeley for canceling an Ann Coulter speech. Okay, so freedom of speech. Okay, but she also led a bunch of lawsuits against the COVID shutdowns, so she's pro getting sick. Oh, she also represented Tucker Carlson in a discrimination lawsuit. So she's a bad person. It's so obvious now. She's a bad right-wing ghoul who specifically uses the law to push far-right ideology and protect, in some cases, Nazis. Like, overtly so. Like, weird that anyone would take what she says seriously. But good news, because Harmeet is most likely not going to be running all of these lawsuit scams anymore now that she's been nominated to head the DOJ Civil Rights Division. Yay. Person who thinks trans people are fake and a menace. Civil Rights Division. But sure, go off about how trans ideology is a top-down conspiracy starting with our government. Anyway, this isn't the only way that these detransitioners are directly connected to obvious right-wing strategists and the f***ing president. All three of the detransitioners I talked about are propped up by the Independent Women's Forum, a non-profit conservative advocacy group that pushes anti-trans messaging and policy around the country. You might have seen their Women's Bill of Rights that they spammed all over social media during the midterms. To hear them say it, they are basically a PR firm for conservatives to reach out to the same groups their policies often screw over.
We bridge the perception gap about conservatives, countering stereotypes, rebranding conservatives, and growing the movement. We bridge the persuasion gap with non-conservatives, winning over women, moderates, millennials, and minorities. And we bridge the messaging gap on challenging issues, turning liabilities into assets.
Yes, they bridge the gap between conservative talking points and, reality. Like, what a lie might do. And for bridging the gap, the IWF has received millions of dollars in funding from various dark money groups and corporations looking to influence voters. This includes Walmart, Amway, multiple gas and petroleum companies, f***ing Betsy DeVos's husband, and of course several nonprofits run by Mr. Leonard Leo himself. Remember him? He's the former VP of the Federalist Society who handpicked Donald Trump's Supreme Court nominations. We talked all about him. Dude is like a skull and bone, snooty, brandy-drinking law pervert and career Republican operative, and he's given the Independent Women's Forum millions of dollars. Doesn't really seem like this is actually about women, does it? So their playbook is simple. The IWF recruits these women to push the message that gender-affirming care is dangerous and transgenderism is fake. And then other groups, like the Alliance Defending Freedom, tag in to file amicus briefs to challenge state and federal laws that protect trans people from discrimination. It's a playbook that the ADF constantly uses to go after all sorts of progressive legislation, including gay marriage and abortion. They've just locked onto a new target. After all, no better way to bridge the gap between conservatives and minorities than to demonize an even smaller group of minorities. Often these women are getting paid or taking in appearance fees for being willing to speak out against the trans ideology. In other cases, they'll go after detransitioned individuals who haven't expressed anti-trans beliefs and try to pressure them into speaking out anyway. Elisa Ray Shoup is a trans woman who was actually the first person in America to receive legal recognition for being non-binary. When she detransitioned back to being a cis man in 2019, she was bombarded with emails by the ADF and adjacent groups. They eventually recruited her to file an amicus brief to the Supreme Court claiming that she was not transgender, but suffered a mental confusion about her gender. Shoup has since reclaimed her trans identity and denounced the anti-trans movement, claiming they used her story to push for conversion therapy. Probably because that's what they did. They are, can't stress it enough, doing the thing they claim is happening. Their claim is that transgender people are young people being manipulated into believing an ideology by outside political forces, taking advantage of their confusion. And to fight this, they are recruiting confused young people to go on TV and risk their entire reputations for an ideology, one that is rooted in politics and not any concern for the well-being of children. As the IWF specifically states, they are trying to make conservatism more appealing to minorities, and they have figured out that the trans issue is a really good way to do that. And they know it's not actually a problem. Just ask diaper pervert Matt Walsh.
How many people have had this done?
Depends on what. I don't think we have exact numbers, but if we're talking about the drugs, it's millions.
You're talking about hormone blockers.
Yeah.
Millions of kids have been on hormone blockers, really? It says over the last 5 years, there were at least 4,780 adolescents who started puberty blockers and had a prior gender dysphoria diagnosis.
This says it's kind of undercounted, but that
would be a big undercounting.
Less than 1,000 people a year.
Yeah.
Yeah, I would guess, hundreds of thousands at this, but I could be wrong.
He could be wrong. Cool. Matt Walsh, if you don't know, has devoted his entire career to demonizing the trans community and made a whole documentary about it and has spoken out continuously against teenagers getting hormones. But could be wrong. Shruggies. Who can say? Kinda odd, right? That the guy who claims to be really deep into the issue never bothered to, look up how many teens are actually taking puberty blockers. Well, heck, Matt, I'll look it up for you. Let me get out my invisible computer, close all the Family Guy porn. So much porn. I'm gonna Bing it. Binging. Binging, binging. Oh, look! According to new research from JAMA Pediatrics, the total number of youths diagnosed with gender dysphoria in America is less than 18,000. And of those 18,000, less than 1,000 accessed puberty blockers. Boy, that is way fewer than 1 million, isn't it, Matt? Less than 1,000 youths. That is such a small fraction of the US population that I'm not gonna even calculate it. Actually, you know what? I got my invisible computer right here, so let me just... Okay. Boop. That is 0.00029859659599881% of the US population that Matt has devoted his career to. And the GOP and freaks like J.K. Rowling are going on a crusade against. Seems weird. You'd think that would be the first thing these people would look into. It's almost like this Matt Walsh fellow and these other concerned folks don't actually care about the data. And it's just so freaking odd they are allowed to speak on this issue at all. Why is that? When the science against trans people is so obviously and proudly junk, why are so many people, including liberals, just ignoring that? When it's so clearly just one more minority in a long line of minorities being constantly scapegoated, why do people still somehow fall for it? Well, after the break, we'll talk about that. Try to pin your gender down for just a minute longer and we will be right back. Careful, it's a squirmer!
Without thinking about it too hard, I predict that 2025 will be the best year ever. Yes, sirree. No problems in 2025. None that I can see. And perhaps to celebrate everything being so very great, it's time to start that business with Shopify. Thanks to their customizable templates, you can get your online store up and running without any coding or design skills required. They also have social media tools to create shoppable posts wherever people are. And not to mention tools to track stuff like shipping and taxes and payments all from one dashboard. Because life is great and will continue to be great. And we will never die. But you gotta get that business going soon. You gotta act. No regrets, none. So head first into 2025. Eyes fully closed. Swing your fists like a windmill and check out Shopify. Sign up for your $1 per month trial period at shopify.com/more news, all lowercase. That's important because established in 2025 just has a nice ring to it, doesn't it? So go to shopify.com/more news to start selling with Shopify today. Once again, that is shopify.com/more news.
Did you do it? Did you figure out your gender? Are you sure? If I paid you, would you be more or less sure? Also, what were we talking about? Oh, that's right. Why conservatives manage to get away with demonizing transgender people when it's clearly just a ruse. I mean, for starters, for a lot of people, it's personal. Look no further than Elon Musk, right? Over the course of a few years, he has gone full-on Nazi, and that began with his public transphobia, which just so happens to coincide with his daughter coming out as trans and ending communication with him. So I guess this video is also for the 44% of Americans who do know a trans person. Plenty of outspoken transphobes have stories like this. Perhaps a family member came out as trans and that bothered them. Or a woman they thought looked too manly tied for 5th place in a sports match. Or to be frank, they're just weirded out by it. Transphobes feel the pressing need to dress it up with bullshit rhetoric and terrible statistical analysis, but at the end of the day, they're just kind of grossed out by trans people. Or rather, they're grossed out by stuff they don't quite understand. Before trans people, it was gay people. Before gay people, it was non-white people. And of course, for many, it still is. But this ew factor is why the conversation about these groups is always framed around the same worries, such as bathrooms. But whatever their reasons, they clearly don't actually care about the children. Because if they did, they'd care about them not committing suicide. I, for one, am a big fan of children, and as I keep saying, I love when they don't commit suicide. It's so cute when they don't do that. And yes, Title Monkey, you can quote me on that. Perfect, thanks a million. So that said, there are other and more complicated reasons behind a lot of transphobia. For example, have you noticed that so many transphobic arguments are about protecting women? That's interesting, and it doesn't matter if they are talking about trans men or trans women too. Like, no one ever speaks out about trans men in men's bathrooms, do they? Why is it only about trans women in women's bathrooms? And when they do speak out about trans men, it's framed around top surgery and testosterone. Have you noticed that? It's certainly what Rowling is talking about in all of her various screeds, and it's what people like Pamela Paul and Abigail Schreier mostly hammer home too. You don't see a lot of uproar about boys facing irreversible damage, which is odd because when we look at the data, we see that actually trans women are more likely to detransition than trans men. So if the anti-trans squad was really concerned about maximizing harm reduction, you'd think they'd be hooting and hollering about protecting boys a lot more. But they don't. What they do instead is frame trans women as predators, men posing as women in order to abuse women. It's almost like there's like some kind of system that categorizes and values people based on their ability to fulfill their reproductive roles in society. And in that system, men are seen as physically more disposable, while women are treated like prized jewels whose worth is defined by the men around them and their ability to be desired by those men. As French philosopher and feminist Simone de Beauvoir put it, man defines woman not herself, but as relative to him. Nice, good quote. Actually kind of says what I just said, but more succinctly and in a more powerful way. Who's this Beauvoir dude? We should get him to write for us. But to put it even more simply, transphobes tend to think that all trans women are male rapists and all trans men are precious fragile little flowers being brainwashed and mutilated by gender ideology, victims of a transition that has stripped them of the one thing that gives them value. That puss, them oves. But honestly, it goes even deeper. The misogyny and transphobia, not that puss. As I already said, before trans people, it was gay people, and so on. There has always been a weird need to scapegoat someone, often around the idea of protecting women or kids. And so there's likely a larger psychology at work. In their new book, Who's Afraid of Gender, trans theorist Judith Butler posits that to those that oppose it, gender has become a phantasm with destructive powers, one way of collecting and escalating multitudes of modern panics. They argue that conservatives, like everyone else, live in today's world and are just as freaked out by all the shit going on as the rest of us. Climate change, various genocides, the slow decay from late-stage neoliberal capitalism. David Zaslav! It's really not looking great out here, folks. Butler argues that gender has become a convenient scapegoat, a catch-all for all the problems conservatism is incapable of acknowledging, and a singular boogeyman to blame. I would go one step further and say this applies to the broad idea of wokeness and extend it not just to conservatives, but any politician protecting wealth. It is so much easier to blame the woke military or woke Hollywood or woke scientists or secret government gender communists than to actually deal with real problems. Just look at how we talk about immigration. Right-wing ghouls will point to something like Springfield, Ohio's hospital system supposedly being overwhelmed with Haitian migrants, and then blame the migrants, not the fact that perhaps our healthcare system should be strong enough to handle an influx of non-English speakers. If you're ever in doubt, think of it like this. There has never been a time in history where the problem was caused by a minority group of people simply existing. If someone is blaming a systemic problem on some vague ideology like wokeness or the inclusion of queer or brown people, they are probably ignoring the actual cause. Or worse, purposefully covering it up. Or even more worse, they probably like the cause and think it's good actually. And think that we should go back to the time where we could openly celebrate that thing. And right now, transphobia is giving them that chance. And the worst part is that right now, they're getting it. The Pamela Paul op-ed we talked about earlier has already been cited in an anti-trans legal brief. 26 states have passed total bans on gender-affirming care for minors so far, and that number is only going to grow if the right gets its way. It's like so bad, you guys. We already talked about a lot of this shit a few years ago, and it's gotten so much worse somehow. Not somehow, I guess, because we know how.
There are some places your boy leaves to school, comes back a girl, okay? Without parental consent.
It's just so embarrassingly obvious that Trump sees transphobia as a way to attack the things he wants to attack, such as the Department of Education, or just anyone in the government he wants to get rid of. He doesn't actually care about trans people, or rather, he used to support them being in his beauty pageants, but now one of his awful sons needs to farm likes by asking how we got to the point where transgender women are winning beauty pageants. So now he doesn't care. He doesn't think about them at all. We know that because he has pretty much told us so.
It's amazing how strongly people feel about that. You see, I'm talking about cutting taxes, people go like that. Talk about transgender, everyone goes crazy. Who would have thought 5 years ago you didn't know what the hell it was?
This is all to say that going after trans people for Trump and a lot of the GOP is one of the first steps needed to wedge in all the fascist shit they want to do. And what's particularly disturbing about that is that it's not just conservatives buying it. Liberals, as we've pointed out, are also eating up the slop, all starting with this notion that detransitioning is a major concern that we need to do something drastic about. It is extremely important, if you're cis, to not buy this garbage, and to speak out when someone else repeats this junk science. Direct them to this video, like and subscribe! Speak out against transphobia wherever and whenever you see it. Support and defend the trans people in your lives, especially trans kids. If they've introspected and they feel a connection to a true self that doesn't match their outer self, at least listen to that. Believe them. Again, if you take just one thing from this video, let it be this. Trans people do exist. They're not a fake ideology, and it's hard to overstate just how impactful even one supportive adult figure can be to a young person who's struggling to come to terms with their identity. And if you're a trans teen, why are you watching this? Go watch that skibbity Mr. Beast or whatever teens are into. Give yourself a break. Hang out with your friends. Hang in there. The world might feel like it's out to get you right now, and that's because in many ways it is. But building community and solidarity with each other is ultimately the only path forward, and living your authentic truth is worth it. Only you can discover that truth for yourself. If you feel the need, reach out to local queer groups or start your own. Support your friends and loved ones in their journeys and try to build lasting structures that can help you serve as mutual aid to each other. Get a mullet. I hear mullets are back. And just be excellent to each other. Like in Bill and Ted, but without the casual homophobia. Remember that? Remember that about Bill and Ted? That's why they went to hell, They also killed cats. Just like those Haitians killed them and ate them. Bill and Ted are in Springfield, Ohio, they're eating the pets, they're eating the cats, they're eating the dogs. God, did they follow up on that? I don't think they cared, actually. I think they made it up and just we're like, well, we did that for a week, now we don't care. They're the president and the vice president now. Are they doing anything about the people eating pets in Springfield? I don't think so. I think it might have been fake. It was fake. It's the end of the video. It's time to like and subscribe. I didn't write anything for this. So it's the end of the video. Like and subscribe. Clap, 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 clap. Leave a comment, I guess. We've got patreon.com/some more news. We've got a podcast called Even More News. And you can listen to this show as a podcast if you'd like. You can also watch that Even More News podcast on YouTube if you want to watch it, see it. We've got a merch store with so much stuff on it. Here's some of it. Thank you, everybody, singing along. So, see you later. That's the end of this. Like and subscribe. Ugh.